Dwight D. Eisenhower is the 34th President of the United States, Republican. He got his start as a general in World War I. Then he was the overall commander of D-Day and most of our European forces in World War II. He then campaigned on the slogan that he would go visit Korea during the Korean War, which he did, and then he became president. While he was president, he signed the truce to end the Korean War. He completed integration of military forces, sent troops into Little Rock, Arkansas to ensure desegregation. And then one of the last things he did as he was leaving office was warned of a U.S. Military-industrial complex, which basically says that the government, the military, and the defense were all correlated and had a very dangerous relationship that was forming. Domino theory during the Cold War, our fear that just like dominoes, if one country fell to communism, the rest would fall to communism. And so that was used as a justification for our intervention in other countries. The Geneva Accords were a collection of meetings whereby a bunch of different countries came together to decide the fate of Vietnam. And the decision was that we were going to divide Vietnam at 17th north latitude, and that Ho Chi Minh was going to be in charge of the north, and the South was going to be influenced by the West, and that within 2 years there was going to be elections to reunite the two Vietnams. So as an effort to prevent the upcoming Vietnam War, it failed. It largely fails because the North invades the South, but also amongst the South, the US-backed leader of Diem was considered corrupt and not well liked by a lot of people in the South, so they're going to form their own insurgency called the Viet Cong, who are going to fight to get rid of Diem and then eventually any non-communist forces. So we're going to be there, starting with Eisenhower and advisors, but more into Kennedy's time, trying to figure this out. Under Johnson, it boils to full-on military war, with the exception of Congress never declaring it. CETO was created to oppose the spread of communism. CETO is the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. It's the equivalent of NATO, but for Southeast Asia. The original members included US, Britain, France, Pakistan, Thailand, and the Philippines, but it didn't work very well and it was disbanded in 1977. The Warren Court was the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Earl Warren. It was responsible for expanding civil liberties, civil rights, and federal power in several key cases, including Brown v. Board of Education, which desegregated the schools, Engel v. Vital, which said that it was unconstitutional for public schools to have an official prayer, Gideon v. Wainwright, which provided criminal defendants with counsel even if you couldn't afford it, and then Griswold v. Connecticut, which established a general right to privacy. So as I said, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas was the Supreme Court case that said separate but equal is not okay. It overturned Plessy v. Ferguson. And there was a lot of Southern resistance to it. Eventually, federal troops had to be called in just to desegregate schools, particularly in Little Rock. But obviously today, it's been successful and it's landmark in that instance. Rosa Parks was influential African-American fighting for civil rights. She refused to give up her seat to a white woman in Alabama. She was tired. She'd been working all day. She didn't want to move to the back of the bus, which was the rule at the time. So she was arrested, and in response, a guy named Martin Luther King Jr. is going to organize a bus boycott, and this is going to lead to further desegregation of public institutions, and it's also going to really be a catalyst behind the civil rights movement. Internationally, the Suez Canal crisis was an intervention between Egypt, who was getting aid from the Soviets, and then also this had something to do with Israel. And so basically it's one of our first, like after the Israel was created and partitioned to give a home to the Jewish population following the Holocaust, this is going to be the next instance of our intervention in the Middle East. Eventually, Eisenhower took back his offer, and Egypt attempted to nationalize the canal. Fearing escalation, we forced France, Britain, and Israel to back down. Interstate Highway Act, or the Federal Aid Highway Act of '56, created by Eisenhower, made a bunch of roads that made it easy to travel between cities as well as to and from work. Martin Luther King was the head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and probably the most influential of the civil rights leaders, preached civil disobedience and nonviolence, led the March on Washington in '63, where he gave the I Have a Dream speech. He was opposed to the Vietnam War, and then he was assassinated by James Earl Ray in 1968. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 was the first Civil Rights Act passed since Reconstruction, and it was issued in response to Brown v. Board of Education. And basically, it created a panel to ensure that voting rights of African Americans were not violated. So as an effort to try to reform voting, because even though African Americans had the right to vote constitutionally, poll taxes and literacy taxes had been implemented to make it so that it was more difficult for them to. The Little Rock Crisis, so in 1957, following Brown v. Board of Education, 9 African-American students wanted to go to what had historically been an all-white school in Little Rock, Arkansas. The Arkansas governor was a guy by the name of Orville Faubus. He is going to urge or use the Arkansas National Guard to block the students from entering the school, and Eisenhower has to send in federal troops to get the students safely into class. There are a lot of incidents of violence as well as nonviolence during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Emmett Till was a teenage African-American who was killed by 2 white men after supposedly whistling at one of their wives. The 2 men were found innocent, even though there were even witnesses to this. In 1960, 4 African-American students in Greensboro, North Carolina sat at the Woolworth white-only lunch counter and refused to leave until they were served. This is going to spark numerous what were called sit-ins throughout the South. And one of the counters is in the Smithsonian. There was an explosion at the Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama that killed 4 African-American girls that was probably set by a supremacist. During voter registration drives in Mississippi, 2 white college students and a local African-American were murdered. Civil rights legislation was enacted as a result. And in 1965, a group marched from Selma, Alabama to Birmingham, Alabama for voting rights, and the Voting Rights Act was passed soon thereafter. You had the Freedom Summer, the Freedom Riders. You know, you've got the creation of some of the more militant groups, but there are a lot of incidents of people pushing for more civil rights. One of the tools that was most influential was the NAACP. They supported sit-ins as a form of nonviolent protest. They did not like the radical groups. They did not like the militant groups. They wanted things to be much more calm, take the moral high road when in doubt. There were several civil rights organizations, however, in addition to the NAACP. These are going to include CORE, or the Congress for Racial Equality, and the SNCC and the Black Panthers. Basically, the key to remember is all these groups wanted civil rights, and they were all pushing for civil rights. But as the groups started to split off and each kind of focus on their own areas, it made the movement less powerful. Internationally, or intergalactically, I suppose, we were simultaneously engaged in an arms and space race with the Russians. And in 1957, seemingly a lot of this is going on, the Russians are going to launch the first satellite into outer space, which was called Sputnik. And this caused a lot of concern with the U.S. because we were scared that we were falling behind the Soviets technologically, which is going to lead to an increased emphasis on science and math education. The Eisenhower Doctrine was created as a partial reaction to the Suez Canal. I remember this largely as the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine applied to the Middle East now. So we're going to give money and aid in the Middle East to fight communists. Television had originally been invented, it depends who you ask, but somewhere between the 20s and the 30s. It depends if you go with Zworykin or Farnsworth as the original creator. Regardless, it was too expensive until around the 50s. By the 50s, you now had mass public buying television. It was used for educational programming, sitcoms, game shows, as well as a variety of news programs. By 1960, over 40 million homes had television. In Cuba, they underwent a revolution whereby their leader, Fulgencio Batista, was overthrown by the communist Fidel Castro. Castro was not originally communist. However, he adopted that name when the U.S. and Cuba started having tensions as kind of a way to further alienate Cuba from the United States. And he's going to sign several treaties with the Soviets for trade purposes, kicking out American business interests, which is going to upset us. In the election of 1960, both Cuba and television come into play when a young and exceptionally hot young man by the name of John Fitzgerald Kennedy ran for president against the then Vice President Richard Nixon. Due to the television, Kennedy won because those who watched it thought that he did better, mainly because of his looks. Those who heard it only, however, thought that Nixon had probably won. Regardless, Kennedy won, and he's hot, so yay. At the end of Eisenhower's presidency, he had to deal with the U-2 spy plane. We had been spying on the Russians, and one of our spy planes, piloted by Francis Gary Powers, was shot down over Russia. Eisenhower lied and said that we weren't spying, and then when the Soviets were like, oh, well, who's this pilot then? Eisenhower had to back down, and it made us look really kind of foolish. JFK, hot, ridiculously hot. See, like even the note cards, it says it right there, ridiculously hot. Can't just be me, right? I may have added that, just possibly. 35th president, he was a Democrat. Vice president was LBJ. He was married to Jackie. First Catholic president, youngest president ever elected. Teddy was younger when he took over for McKinley, but JFK is the youngest elected. Because when Teddy gets elected for his term, he is older than Kennedy was. It's kind of confusing. His domestic programs, like his equivalent of the New Deal, was called the New Frontier. This included tax reforms, educational aid, and emphasis on the space program, promising to land a man on the moon. He raised minimum wage. The Bay of Pigs, however, would come back and hurt him, which is the next thing. He also establishes the Peace Corps. He's going to be a leader during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then he's assassinated in Dallas, Texas, on November 22nd, 1963, by Lee Harvey Oswald in one of the bleakest days in American history. The Bay of Pigs, so Eisenhower had promised to help revolutionaries to overthrow Castro at this invasion. Then Kennedy, it's going to happen during Kennedy's term. Kennedy backs out at the last minute and doesn't communicate it in time. And so the revolutionaries showed up and they got slaughtered. And as a result, this is one of the biggest failures of Kennedy's presidency. It also doesn't help when he goes to Berlin and says he's a jelly donut. A giant wall had been built between East and West Berlin to keep the two sides safe, apparently, and also to try to control influence from either side. And it stopped defections and the travels between the two. It was eventually torn down in 1989. The Alliance for Progress was JFK's equivalent of taking, again, the Marshall Plan, but now applying it to Latin American countries, where we were giving economic aid to anybody fighting against communists, but it wasn't very effective. So after the Bay of Pigs, now Castro's pissed, so he's like, ooh, enemy of my enemy is my friend. Who will I go to? I know, Cuba. So he becomes friends with, Russia, Khrushchev. So Cuba and Russia become friends. Russia starts putting nukes in Cuba, pointed at us, 90 miles away. We, meanwhile, have nukes in Turkey pointed at Russia. We find the nukes. We engage in this really intense 13-day negotiation, which includes embargoes and sanctions on Cuba, powerful speeches in the United Nations by Representative Adlai Stevenson. But ultimately, after 13 days, Kennedy is able, as Dean Rusk says, to get the other fellow to blink. Khrushchev removes the missile sites. We're going to lift the blockade, but keep our sanctions and embargo in place. Eventually, we dismantle our weapons in Turkey, and the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963 was created, which the U.S., Britain, and the Russians agrees not to perform nuclear tests in the atmosphere or underwater. Back to civil rights, James Meredith obtained a federal court order to allow him to enroll at the University of Mississippi. He became the first African American to graduate from Ole Miss. He had been barred from enrolling several times previously. And it took federal marshals to help him, but he endured a very, very tough several years in college, graduated, and then walked across the state in protest. Engel v. Vitale was a Supreme Court case that said prayer that was created by the New York State Board of Regents was unconstitutional. Even though the prayer was non-denominational, sponsored prayer in school went against the First Amendment's establishment of separation of church and state. In Baker v. Carr, Tennessee had failed to gerrymander its state legislature for 60 years despite growth in population movement. So Baker, who was a Tennessee voter, brought suit against the state, arguing a violation of equal protection. Baker claimed that his vote had been diluted. The Supreme Court held that the political question would be heard, opening the way for numerous voting lawsuits.